Far-right rallies that were planned in Newcastle, Liverpool, Basildon, Wakefield and Shrewsbury did not materialise over the weekend, indicating perhaps that the rapid, harsh sentencing meted out to those already arrested is working as a deterrent. The National Police Chiefs Council said that by Saturday, 779 people had been arrested in connection with the riots. 349 of them have been charged. Many of them turned out to be teenagers, habitual criminals, or just people wandering around on the fringe looking for something to do. Anti-racist rallies have become more common, but nobody thinks this issue is dealt with. And one of the ideas that's taken root is that of two-tier policing from two-tier care. Are we going to have to deal with a very different Britain that's been changed for the worse by these events? Raf, this has been billed as Keir Starmer's first crisis, the first big test for him. And depending on which paper you read, he's either clearly passed it or it's revealed his weaknesses and it's all his fault. From a purely political point of view, how do you think he has dealt with it?
I think you've seen both the best and the worst of Keir Starmer as a politician in this. And I think the best is better than the worst, which is reassuring. I mean, by that, I mean, look, even before the election, and running up to Keir Starmer sort of going from being someone who's unlikely to ever be prime minister to someone who's a complete shoo-in to prime minister, the proposition was always he's just this slightly uninspiring but serious, pragmatic guy whose main interest is in good administration and getting things done, isn't very good at the colourful rhetorical storytelling aspects of politics. And you've seen that play out exactly here. So the good thing that he's done is just make the decisions, the executive decisions, grip it, work out what needs doing, deploying his experience from when he was Director of Public Prosecutions in 2010, 2011, when there were riots the last time. And actually, in terms of just clamping down on it, getting the police mobilized, making political choices that contained it relatively effectively, I think he probably made the right choices. Where he hasn't sort of been visible, or he hasn't displayed a very important political skill, is matching that with the kind of storytelling, what I've sometimes described as the evangelical aspect of politics, where you kind of have to bring people along and offer the reassurance, talk about whether this isn't the country we are, this isn't who we are, and just somehow putting a template of moral language onto the situation so people can look back and remember and go, okay, that was the point where Keir Starmer intervened and we all got to feel actually he speaks for the country. And it was a critical moment and you kind of needed a little bit of that. The fact that we haven't had that, I don't think is a disaster, but it is a warning about that deficiency in him. It's real, and there will come times in the future where, again, that is where he seems to be lacking.
Those massive punitive sentences. The current DPP is promising 10-year sentences for anybody arrested in further violence. Is that a message purely to people who might be involved in the violence, or is it a message to the country at large that this is not the Labour Party you thought you might get, the one that the Mail has been telling you you're going to get?
I think it's more the former. I wouldn't underestimate the extent to which Keir Starmer, as a former Director of Public Prosecutions, as someone who worked with the police service in Northern Ireland, where civil disorder was never potentially that far away, you had to take the fear of law and order completely breaking down very seriously. He is actually genuinely, sincerely quite hardcore on this stuff, and also understands that when you're policing rioting, you're in a sort of different category of sentencing. The importance of deterrence and just saying, look, actually, if there are people who are sort of on the fringe, maybe being sucked into this, you have to make it absolutely clear there is no free pass here. There's no license. I'm not saying that's the right way to do it, but certainly I think he sincerely believes that is what the moment required. And obviously part of that is the fact that Labour has to demonstrate, or still feels it has to demonstrate, that it's a party that can be taken seriously on law and order. But I think that's so ingrained in who Keir Starmer is politically that it's not actually a performance. I think that really is the person, the Prime Minister that we have.
We haven't really seen significant far-right riots in England and Britain since the 1970s, but a lot of the excuse makers now have been saying, well, it's not far right to be angry about immigration. I've never seen voices that appear in newspapers excuse rioting before. That blurring of the line between legitimate concerns and street violence, is that something that we're going to have to live with now? Have we kind of crossed something there?
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I agree that sort of the far right on the rampage feels like a whole new order of problem for British politics. But I mean, in 2001, you had rioting in Bradford. So that's actually within our memory. Okay, I can just about remember the 1970s, but I was very little. What's interesting in terms of the sort of apologizing for it, or a rhetorical device of saying, well, these are legitimate grievances, we have to take it seriously. There is always that potential frame available for analysing riots. And the reality is, if it's, when it was Black Lives Matter pulling down the statue of Edward Colston, there were people saying, well, look, there is an enormous frustration here. And actually, some people will call this criminal damage. Other people will say this is, righteous indignation. When there was rioting in London in 2010, 2011, there were people on the left saying, well, actually, if you do austerity, if you let communities sort of fester in poverty and with no sense of hope and opportunity for young people, they're going to express that in rage. And it was people on the right then saying, well, look, these are just thugs and hoodlums and they're enjoying the opportunity to commit crime, and just lock them up and throw away the key. So I think we shouldn't be too hasty in saying, oh, no, suddenly a sort of a firewall has gone down and the mainstream but quite radical anti-immigration right is now hand in glove with the far right who like violence and want to legitimize that. There's on top of that, the fact is sometimes people just riot, and it happens in the summer when it's hot, and it's like football hooliganism. So there's some spark. You can almost overanalyze it sometimes, and these things happen. They flare up and they subside. So, but all of that having been said, I do agree with the premise of your question, which is that we are slightly paying the wages now of a long process by which the boundary between what people on the right could say about immigration and it receive opprobrium because it was considered the language and idiom of extremism. So about people being swamped, sort of invasions, hordes, everything that we saw in the Brexit campaign, the Breaking Point poster. That boundary was blurred. The Conservative Party blurred that boundary with Nigel Farage. Now, interesting, you see Nigel Farage sort of worried about that boundary blurring between him and Tommy Robinson. And that whole spectrum now seems to have become a bit of a mush. And I think it's quite important now, actually, that the sort of centre-right of politics re-erect some of those fences. I mean, we on the sort of liberal side of things can bemoan it all we like, but ultimately it's for, I think, sort of mainstream conservatives to actually start taking a look at themselves on that.
Marie, one of the standouts of this whole episode has been that role of political influencers, columnists, general shit posters, that whole convoluted universe where legitimate journalists and I'm a citizen journalist and I'm just asking questions all crosses over. Worst of the lot has undoubtedly been Elon Musk with his civil war is now inevitable tweets. He's sharing that ridiculous story about detainment camps in the Falklands. I mean,
no, we didn't talk about those, Andrew. We're not meant to know. We're not meant to know.
Well, I'll be found dead in a ditch having mentioned them on a podcast. Starmer has not responded to any of this. His spokespeople have been treating it with derision. What is Musk trying to achieve here, apart from to drive down the value of his brand still further?
It's not entirely clear, and I think the problem is no one's quite managed. I think that there's been quite a few good features on Elon Musk and his kind of descent into madness, but no one's quite managed to get to the bottom of exactly why he's doing all this. So I think I could tell, I'm split entirely 50-50 between he's shit-stirring because he enjoys shit-stirring and kind of owning the left and owning the libs because he's kind of part of that thing, but also half going, no, that is a man who, that's been written a lot. I feel like I'm not libeling him, slandering him by saying that, but, who takes quite a lot of ketamine, doesn't sleep that much, I think has a weird, messy personal life. So maybe he's managed to somehow convince himself that, Britain is a kind of like communist hellscape and is trying to be like, oh my God, what's going on? And generally, I think it's probably a bit of both. And I have no idea, and there's no way to know to what extent it's more one or the other.
I wouldn't underestimate the extent to which also US politics and US cultural discourse just sees the UK as an outpost of a cultural argument that is actually intrinsically American. They're not really that interested in or engaged in actual British politics and any of the cultural hinterland that defines the situation here. It's just another sort of tool in the rhetorical arsenal. And so the Britain that Elon Musk is talking about is not the real place. It's not the country we're living in or the country we're discussing. And it's sort of a mistake to try and even analyze it in those terms. It's this sort of cartoon show of what Britain looks like if you live in right-wing channels in American politics.
Which I think says to me that we're not the intended audience.
Oh, of course not.
Because we can look out the window and see that,
well, that's the standard response, isn't it?
That's not
London
there,
has
right?
fallen,
Yeah.
a million pictures posted of a duck pond, somebody on a bike.
So it's obviously intended for a different audience. And that's why I would put it in the general area of do you remember the big thing about Sweden, like becoming a sort of...
Sweden was essentially Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, basically. And then Trump's obsession with Sadiq Khan for about a month, where we were all going, how does he even know who Sadiq Khan is? I mean, that's just weird. This was while he was president of the United States. And it's like, what are you doing? How has this triggered you? And I think looking at it like that, you have to come to the conclusion that it's intended for their audience. They are creating things outside the US because they know their base is not the traveling kind. And so they're creating this imaginary things that they can say, if you vote for Kamala Harris, you will become like England. There'll be riots. Or you will become like Sweden, where everyone gets raped.
There'll be Sharia law.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think there's a couple of other things in the background. I think Musk understands that there is butt-clenching regulation coming down the line from the EU and the UK. And so he's placing himself in a position where he can say, they're punishing me because I spoke against them. You know, Starmer is doing this to me because I criticized him, which is a lovely, comfy position for him to be in. And then the second thing is that I sense he's kind of testing the tensile strength of a mature Western democracy ahead of the US elections, and sort of how his bot network and the blue tick thing works, because of the big proper fight that's coming over there.
But so I hear all of this, but I think part of me is also, what if he's gone quite mad and he doesn't really sleep anymore?
Completely.
Like,
Listen, he's showing
and I think all of those are possible at the same time.
If you put him in the prevent program, they would, red lights would be going on and they would be saying, this is someone who has been radicalized online.
Paul Mason, who I talked to for a bunker that's out right now, actually, if you're listening on Tuesday, says the government should replace the Ofcom leadership, bring in people who will do their job and revoke GB News' license, and should consider blocking Twitter. What do we think?
Oh, I mean, I would be delighted. I think I've tweeted and written and said on this podcast everything that politicians should just stop going on GB News altogether, and mainstream journalists should stop going on GB News and entertaining them, because that's what they get their power from. I feel like one small silver lining to the riots might be that people are waking up to this. I think GB News crossed the line. Like we were talking about earlier, the fact that the tabloids were a bit like, oh God, our actions have consequences, like, you know, row back. GB News, I think at least a lot of their presenters double down. So yes, I do really hope we're seeing the beginning of the end of GB News' sort of mainstream allowed outlet. And for that reason, I'm not convinced they should lose their license now, because again, then it'd be really easy for every, you know, tedious prick who works for them to go, well, we've been silent. Yeah. So I think just let them quietly die would be my preferred solution. But let's see
Twitter,
what happens.
I mean, we're all, for whatever reason, still on it.
Yeah.
I sit there debating, you know, the fact it is still the biggest platform, and the irony of saying how shit it is.
Decanting followers to Blue Sky very, very actively.
Is it our duty then to get off Twitter?
I'm sincerely entirely split. I feel like, you know, I'm a freelance journalist still to this day, and I think its change is not quite as powerful as before, but a lot of my commissioning editors are on Twitter, a lot of my readers are on Twitter, a lot of the ideas I get are from Twitter. Like, my career, for good or ill, was started essentially on Twitter. I can't, you know, if I were to leave, I would have to fundamentally rethink nearly everything about the way I make money and pay my rent. So for that reason, you know, like, I don't live, but also I'm acutely aware of the fact that, you know, I'm making a choice by staying, which I'm not entirely comfortable with.
Alex, on a more cheerful note, last Wednesday, right after we recorded the podcast, did feel like a little bit of a turning point in the whole story, in that the, you know, anti-racist demonstrations broke out all over the country, attended not just by the full-time politically committed, but by loads and loads of ordinary people, not just in places like Walthamstow, but also, like you're an ordinary person. Places like Devon, you know, but not known for being, you know, placards and banners, and it felt really kind of cheering. And you mentioned that even the right-wing press were on it and said this is real Britain. However, the supposed right-wing attacks on migrant lawyer offices that were supposed to materialise, none of them happened, and the kind of leaked hit list on Telegram turned out to be, you know, largely a fabrication. Even Nick Lowell's of Hope Not Hate said it looks like it's a hoax. Does this mean that the far right now have a kind of form of veto on public life, and they can just like put out the idea, we're going to attack a bunch of places, and you'll see what you saw last week, which was pubs were boarding up, people going home from work early, churches were cancelling events, social events. You don't think that's going to happen?
I mean, the short answer is no, because I don't think they come away from it. No one is thinking, how clever the far right are. They punked us. They come away from it looking like failures. They come away looking like someone who tried to organize a party and no one turned up. And that, I think, to me, has been the most stunning aspect of what we've seen in the last 10 days. The fact that, the environment we were just talking about, Twitter, with just this army of blue tick, plainly troll bot accounts, who just completely astroturf everything. We know how that works, right? We've studied that. We know that it works by making the person who really does hold those views thinking, gosh, there are a lot of people who think like me. You mustn't bring that into contact with reality. And that's what they tried to do. If they had tried to organize like one big concentrated rally in London, then they could have perpetuated the narrative that there are many of us. You have support out there. Instead, what they tried to do is they said, we're going to do it in 50 cities. And then suddenly they found out that the support, they've been told by the Mail, by the Telegraph, by the Express, that the silent majority who is behind you, actually no one turned up. And so they stood there looking like tits in the middle of a city like Sunderland of 250,000 people, or Liverpool, twice that, and only about 100 of them turned up. And they stood there DMing, I don't know, Alt Bob 562134, saying, "Are you coming? You said that when we take to the streets, you'd be here. Where are you? I can't see you." Almost like they believed those were real people, and that somehow this would mutate into something bigger. And it just didn't. And that, I think, has shocked them. And that, I think, has shocked the press that would support something like that. They just didn't get the response they expected to get. And it's down to them drinking their own Kool-Aid. They've been saying for such a long time that everyone thinks this, they're just afraid to say it. And actually, when they put that proposition to the country said, fuck you. We don't. You don't speak for us.
Yeah. Raf, I want to ask you a bit about the two-tier policing thing, which has been the most depressing thing that seems to have taken root. The idea that people can process the events of the past 10 days, and what they take away is, I'm the victim. Why do you think it's taken root so firmly?
Well, it's interesting. It's a new iteration of a relatively recent, but actually quite well-established far-right tactic. And I don't mean by that someone sort of preconceived it and deployed it, but it's just something that's evolved, which is recognizing that previously it was taken for granted that because essentially white people were the majority and minorities were therefore potentially vulnerable to victimization and victimhood, the whole conversation about the far right was a power dynamic that essentially, minorities were potential victims. And to be able to sort of do this sort of rhetorical jujitsu where you say, no, actually, we are the victims. Actually, there is this cultural establishment which has deployed the power of the state and organized, through, whether it was political correctness through multicultural institutions and now co-opting the police who are all busy taking the knee and all these other things and becoming woke. You get to pay in that currency of victimhood a set of rhetorical arguments that weren't previously available. And it can be fantastically disorienting because you then suddenly have to say, because it's resonant for a lot of people. If you live in a community where, to use the cliche, people feel left behind, feel neglected, they haven't had any investment, they feel a bit marginalized. It is quite feasible that you have been somehow, you are on the receiving end of contempt and hatred by the state. And then you join that up with mass migration and various other arguments, and it kind of works. I don't mean it's at all true. I mean, obviously, actually, the people who are most likely to be the victims of prejudice at the hands of the police are not white people. I mean, all the evidence and the data show that very, very clearly. I mean, one other thing in terms of why it's really caught and why it feels so resonant, I do think it's worth flagging. I mean, there were debates about the pro-Palestinian marches in London where people were saying, well, hang on a second, some of these slogans sound like they're calling for genocide, or some of these slogans basically sound like the stuff you'd hear from really radical Islamists. Why aren't police doing anything about that? I mentioned earlier the Black Lives Matter protest where people thought, well, hang on, tearing down the statue, that's criminal damage. Why didn't you react more vigorously then? Actually, people were arrested. But also Rotherham, I think, is really important here. And it's something that, in the case where you had systematic sexual abuse of young, mostly white girls by older, mostly Pakistani men. And in the aftermath of that, it did become quite clear that some of the officials involved, social workers and police, because of not knowing how to navigate the local community, not knowing how to talk about it, fearing that they would be accused of racism, that really did impede the investigation. And although that, sort of the waters closed over that argument for a lot of people, and liberal opinion sort of moved on and didn't really talk about it very much, for an awful lot of people who are potentially receptive to this two-tier policing argument, they remember that really, really clearly. And that's really gone in deep as a sense of actually the police and the officials, they're kind of against us and on the side of a multicultural conspiracy. So there's a lot of stuff swirling around in there that has to be unpicked quite carefully.
On Rotherham, quite briefly, and I know it's slightly off topic, but I can't not say it. One of the things that really annoys me about that is I think the police fucked up, but also the police fucks up so often when women and girls are abused by men. Like, it's not, as and as you said, there were definitely some things which could have been done better. But more broadly, it's not about race, it's about misogyny. And I feel like they latched onto that, and it's been like, oh, tremendous, you've noticed that actually it really fucking sucks to be a woman or a girl trying to report something to the police, especially that happens at the hand of a man. Can I interest you in nearly every other case where this happened in Britain?
No. And the answer is no. Yeah.
Marie, how much of a problem is the two-tier idea for Starmer? It's very, very unfortunate that the tier rhymes with Keir, isn't it? Very unfortunate indeed.
I think I'm going to be quite boring and say it is quite hard to predict, because I think that, that thing, even that Boris Johnson, slightly fanned the flames of, but the idea that Keir Starmer had let Jimmy Savile go and was aware on some level. I can't remember what the exact story was, but that was a thing that came up again and again. And I remember talking to someone at the time who did focus groups and who said, obviously I can't predict what will happen at an election, but weirdly this is something that comes up quite often in focus groups of people sincerely believing that, Keir Starmer had been this on the side of Savile. So I think that there's a risk it becomes that. One of those things, again, you don't pick up in polling. You don't massively see, apart from, maybe some corners of the mainstream press, but sort of just ends up seeping through some corners of the internet, and you just end up getting a minority, but still people believing that it's true and it's a thing.